As we get closer to the PS5 launch, we are getting more and more news about how the PS5 is going to perform. And one of the pieces of news that we have today is from the Ratchet and Clank developers, who talk about how Ratchet and Clank is going to run on the PS5. And they say that it's going to be in either 4K resolution and 30 frames per second, or the player can choose to go to a lower resolution. And they don't say what the resolution is, but it will be 60 frames per second. But let's go to the quote first, and then we'll come back and discuss. So the quote is from Famitsu, which is a Japanese magazine. So it says here, "I understand. Also, what frame rates and resolutions are supported?" And the answer is, increasing the beauty of the microphone image reduces the frame rate, which is a difficult balance to achieve in any game. In this game, we focused on balancing the comfort of the action with beautiful graphics while allowing players to choose between two different resolutions and frame rates. One is a 4K resolution at 30 frames per second, and the other is a lower resolution at 60 frames per second. We're planning to offer either of these two options. Ishitate: I'd like to add that in Ratchet and Clank, starting in the latter half of the PS3 era, we've chosen to ditch the 60 frames per second of the PS2 era for 30 frames per second in order to make the graphics more beautiful, and the actual gameplay has been made at 30 frames per second. This time around, players can choose whether to go 60 frames per second routes of the PS2 era or the high resolution and 30 frames per second route of the PS3 and beyond. So as you can see there, they don't say what the resolution is, but I'm probably going to bet that it's going to be around 1440p because it's half the resolution of 4K. And if they're going to go either 30 or 60, it will probably be 1440p. And I think they will probably just upscale that back to 4K, but I guess obviously it probably won't look as crisp as 4K on a native 4K monitor. So as you know, the PS5 is reported to be at 10 teraflops, and now remember Mark Cerny said that true 4K was going to be 8 teraflops, and that was said last generation when the PS4 Pro was announced. So when you think about it, if 8 teraflops is 4K 30 frames per second, then it stands to reason that you probably need about 16 teraflops to get 4K 60, true 4K 60 anyway. And I think that if you're at 10 teraflops, then you're probably not going to quite make it to 4K 60. And that's what the developers are struggling with, even with a lot of tools and tricks that they have up their sleeve to kind of bring that, to try and make it reach 4K 60. I think that they're just not quite getting there. And the other point that I want to mention is that it's starting to look as though that the PS5 is going to probably be a 4K 30 frames per second machine, which is really interesting now because the choices that you're going to have on the market will be an Xbox Series X, which is 4K 60 frames per second, and also you're probably going to get a Xbox Series S, which is going to be 1080p 60 frames per second. So there are two 60 frames per second boxes, and then there's going to be a PS5, which will kind of jump back between the two. Some games will be 4K 60, some games that will be 4K 30 frames per second, and then other times there'll be some 60 frames per second games, but it might have a lower resolution. Alright, so that about does it for this news report. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think the PS5 can do 4K 60 maybe at a later date? Or do you think that the PS5 will just be a 4K 30 frames per second console? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you like this video, click on the like button and subscribe to the channel for more gaming news. Thanks for watching.